Howard Carter pushed a candle through a small hole in a sealed doorway and waited for his eyes to adjust. At first there was only darkness. Then shapes began to appear. Strange animal forms, black statues, broken pieces of chariots, and flashes of gold everywhere. Lord Carnarvon, standing behind him, finally asked the obvious question. Could he see anything? Carter answered with two words that would become legendary: wonderful things. But there was something he still could not see. The pharaoh himself. And this was only the first room. By November 1922, Carter had spent years searching the Valley of the Kings for the tomb of a nearly forgotten young ruler named Tutankhamun. Other archaeologists had already uncovered many royal burials, and some believed there was nothing important left to find. Carter disagreed. Small objects bearing Tutankhamun's name had been found in the valley. Somewhere, he believed, the king's tomb had to exist. The problem was money. Lord Carnarvon, the wealthy British aristocrat financing the excavation, had grown tired of paying for seasons that produced almost nothing. Carter persuaded him to fund one final attempt. Then on November 4, 1922, workers uncovered a stone step beneath the sand. Another step appeared below it, then another. The staircase descended toward a plastered doorway. Carter could see ancient seals on it, including signs connected with the royal necropolis. But the doorway also showed evidence that someone had entered and resealed it in antiquity. That created an immediate problem. Had they finally found a royal tomb, only to discover that ancient robbers had emptied it thousands of years earlier? Carter did not rush inside. He protected the entrance and sent a telegram to Carnarvon in England. Carnarvon traveled to Egypt with his daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert. On November 24th, the excavation resumed. 2 days later, Carter made the small opening in the second sealed doorway and looked into darkness. What he saw was not an orderly royal chamber. It looked almost chaotic. Huge ceremonial beds, shaped like strange animals, filled part of the room. Chariots had been dismantled and stacked together. Boxes, chairs, baskets, statues, and other objects crowded the space. 2 black, life-sized statues stood like silent guards near another sealed doorway. Many surfaces glittered with gold. For an archaeologist, the scene was almost overwhelming. For a storyteller, it creates an even better question. If this was only the antechamber, what was behind the guarded door? Before that door could be opened, Carter's team had to document what was already in front of them. The objects were fragile. Some had been sitting untouched for more than 3,000 years. Removing them was not like clearing furniture from an old room. Each piece had to be photographed, numbered, recorded, stabilized, and carefully moved. And the more they worked, the stranger the collection became. There were royal thrones and stools, bows and arrows, walking sticks, clothing, jewelry, games, food containers, chariots, beds, model boats, ritual objects, everyday objects, things intended for a king's life, and things intended for his life after death. This was not simply treasure storage. To the ancient Egyptians, death was a transition. A king would need protection, food, clothing, symbols of power, magical objects, and ritual equipment for the journey into the next world. The tomb was built not as a museum, but as a machine for eternity. And yet the most important object was still missing: Tutankhamun. The 2 black guardian statues stood beside another sealed entrance. Behind it was the burial chamber. When Carter finally opened that passage in February 1923, the scale changed instantly. The room was dominated by an enormous gilded wooden shrine that occupied almost the entire chamber. But opening that shrine did not reveal the king. Inside it was another shrine, then another, then another. The burial of Tutankhamun had been constructed in layers, one protective shell inside the next. Eventually, the team reached a massive stone sarcophagus. Inside were nested coffins, each bringing them closer to the body of the pharaoh. And then came one of the most famous objects ever discovered in archaeology. The innermost coffin was made of solid gold, and inside lay the mummy of Tutankhamun. Covering his head and shoulders was the now iconic golden funerary mask, A calm young face, blue and gold striped headdress, carefully shaped eyes, and the royal symbols of Upper and Lower Egypt. Today, that mask is so famous that it is easy to forget how extraordinary the surrounding discovery was. And even after the burial chamber was opened, the tomb kept producing new visual shocks. A smaller room, now called the treasury, contained a black jackal figure of Anubis, stretched over a shrine, model boats, chests, and the elaborate canopic equipment that protected the king's internal organs. Another side chamber, the annex, was packed so tightly with objects that it looked less like a carefully arranged royal room and more like a storeroom frozen in time. Every new doorway changed the scale of the discovery. What first looked like a chamber of gold was becoming an entire preserved system of royal burial. Tutankhamun had not been one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs. He ruled for only about a decade and died when he was still very young. His reign was overshadowed by larger political and religious changes, yet because his tomb survived with so much of its burial equipment still inside, he became one of the most recognizable rulers in human history. The tomb contained thousands of objects. And that is where the discovery becomes more interesting than a room full of gold. Some objects showed how the young king traveled, hunted, dressed, and presented himself. Others reflected beliefs about protection and rebirth. There were tiny figures intended to work for him in the afterlife. Amulets were placed with the body. Food and drink were provided. Images and spells were meant to help him cross from death into eternal existence. To modern eyes, many of these objects look like art. To the people who buried Tutankhamun, they had jobs to do. And that brings us to the part of the story that newspapers loved even more than the gold: the curse. Ancient Egyptians certainly believed in magic, divine protection, and punishment. Tombs could contain warnings, protective formulas, and ritual texts. But one of the most famous claims associated with Tutankhamun, that a terrifying inscription threatened death to anyone who disturbed the pharaoh, has a major problem. No such dramatic curse was found written at the entrance to Tutankhamun's tomb. The legend grew after the discovery, and then something happened that made it explode. Lord Carnarvon died in Cairo in April 1923, only months after the burial chamber had been opened. His death was linked to an infected mosquito bite that became seriously infected. But newspapers had a much better story. A wealthy man enters the sealed tomb of an ancient king. Weeks later, he is dead. The pharaoh has taken revenge. From there, almost every illness, accident, or death connected in any way to the excavation could be folded into the legend. Stories appeared about mysterious warnings, dying pets, strange coincidences, and supernatural punishment. Some accounts became more dramatic each time they were repeated. There was just one awkward problem for the curse: Howard Carter himself. The man who searched for the tomb, opened the sealed doors, entered the chambers, and spent years working with the objects, did not suddenly die. He lived until 1939. That does not prove that every strange story surrounding the excavation was invented. It does show why the popular version of the curse is much stronger as mythology than as evidence. In fact, mummy curses were already part of Western popular imagination before Tutankhamun's tomb was discovered. Victorian and early 20th century fiction had played with the idea of ancient Egyptian revenge. Tutankhamun gave that old fantasy the perfect real-world setting: a sealed tomb, a dead king, unimaginable treasure, and the sudden death of a famous sponsor. The media did the rest. Tutankhamun did not create the curse story. Tutankhamun made it famous. But there is another mystery that is completely real. Why did this tomb survive at all? The Valley of the Kings had been robbed repeatedly in antiquity. Tutankhamun's tomb itself showed evidence of ancient intrusion. Yet much of its burial equipment remained. Part of the answer may be simple luck. The tomb was relatively small, and later construction and debris helped hide its entrance. Over centuries, people effectively lost track of where it was. A king who had faded from history was protected by being forgotten. Then, one uncovered step reversed everything. Carter's team would spend years documenting and removing the contents. The discovery transformed Tutankhamun from an obscure young pharaoh into a global symbol of ancient Egypt. His treasures traveled through books, newspapers, museums, and exhibitions. His golden face became instantly recognizable. And perhaps that is the strangest part of the story. The supposed curse did not destroy Tutankhamun's memory. It helped make him immortal. 3,000 years after his burial, Carter looked through a tiny opening and saw gold in the darkness. He thought he had found a royal tomb. What he had actually found was something bigger, a time capsule of belief, wealth, death, and rebirth, preserved long enough for the modern world to open the door. Tutankhamun had been buried so that he could live forever in the next world. In a way no ancient priest could have predicted, he did.